The Aramaic Targums, brought to you by JesusSpokeAramaic.com. What are the Aramaic Targums? The Targums, or Targumim in Hebrew, are the official translations of the Tanakh or Hebrew Bible into Aramaic, considered authoritative by Judaism. Targum simply means translation, and Targumim is plural in Hebrew and therefore mean translations. The Targums were translated by Jews as the need arose for translations of the books of the Hebrew Bible into Aramaic. They have an official or approved status within Judaism, whereas the Peshitta Tanakh or Peshitta Old Testament is an independent, but still Jewish, translation of the Hebrew Bible into Aramaic, which has not gained official acceptance or approval amongst Jews. Generally, the Targums are preferred by Jews, whereas the Peshitta Old Testament seems to have been adopted or preferred by the early Christians. The Targums have an interesting history. After the Babylonian exile, Jews were exiled into Babylon, where Aramaic was the official language of the Babylonian Empire. Since the exiled Israelites were forced to speak Aramaic rather than their traditional Hebrew, over the years they became more familiar with Aramaic in everyday usage. Hebrew, of course, continued to be used in religious worship because it was the language in which the Hebrew Bible was written. However, as time went by and decades turned into centuries, Hebrew steadily declined as a spoken language in favor of Aramaic. Over time, Jews translated individual books or groups of books of the Hebrew Bible into Aramaic for wider availability in what had by now become their everyday spoken language. These ancient Targums or translations are still available today. They are still used by Jews, yet are almost entirely ignored by other Bible students. As we demonstrate in our video lesson the importance of the Aramaic Targums are very important and have a huge amount to offer Bible students. They reveal the context of the New Testament writings and how Jesus and the disciples would have understood the parables Jesus spoke and the debates he had with the scribes, Pharisees, and Sadducees. And yet, despite these valuable insights, the Aramaic Targums remain heavily underutilized and undervalued by most Bible students today. The origins of the Aramaic Targums go back to Nehemiah's time, where we read in the Tanakh, Nehemiah chapter 8, verses 1 to 8, "And all the people gathered themselves together as one man into the street that was before the water gate, and they spake unto Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had commanded to Israel. And Ezra the priest brought the law before the congregation, both of men and women, and all that could hear with understanding, upon the first day of the 7th month. And he read therein before the street that was before the water gate, from the morning until midday, before the men and the women, and those that could understand, and the ears of all the people were attentive unto the book of the law. And Ezra the scribe stood upon a pulpit of wood, which they had made for the purpose. And Ezra opened the book in the sight of all the people, for he was above all the people. And when he opened it, all the people stood up. And Ezra blessed the Lord, the great God. And all the people answered, Amen, Amen, with lifting up their hands. And they bowed their heads and worshipped the Lord with their faces to the ground. And the Levites caused the people to understand the law, and the people stood in their place. So they read in the book and in the law of God distinctly, and gave the sense, and caused them to understand the readings." Thus, 70 years after the exile into Babylon, the Jews started returning to the land of Israel under Ezra and Nehemiah. Forced to speak Aramaic in Babylon, they were by now much more familiar with Aramaic than with Hebrew. The above passage from the Hebrew Bible records how the law, Torah, was read in public in Hebrew, but that the people were made to understand the sense, i.e., the Hebrew was translated for them into Aramaic to make sure they understood what was being said. Over time, these oral Aramaic translations became written down, forming the Aramaic Targums that we have today. By the end of the Babylonian exile, Aramaic as a spoken language had become so widespread that Jews were no longer accustomed to speaking Hebrew. In fact, Nehemiah laments that an understanding of Hebrew could no longer be taken for granted. Nehemiah chapter 13, "In those days also I saw Jews that had married wives of Ashdod, of Ammon, and of Moab. And their children spake half in the speech of Ashdod, and could not speak in the Jews' language, but according to the language of each people. And I contended with them, and cursed them, and smote certain of them, and plucked off their hair, and made them swear by God, saying, You shall not give your daughters unto their sons, nor take their daughters unto your sons, or for yourselves. Did not Solomon king of Israel sin by these things? Here, the phrase, the Jews' language, is referring to Hebrew, the everyday language of which was by this time starting to decline. It is important to realize that the Aramaic Targums arose according to need. That is, the books of the Tanakh were translated into Aramaic as and when required, at different times and by different people. The Targums are therefore not a single translation of the whole Tanakh as a single effort. Instead, there are different Aramaic translations of different books of the Hebrew Bible, varying in quality and how good they are. Over time, some of these Targums have gained an authoritative status, and some have not. In a later lesson, we investigate the different Targums that are available. This introduction to the Aramaic Targums is enough to show that the history of the Targums is very different from that of the Peshitta Tanakh, or Aramaic Old Testament. Although the Peshitta Tanakh is still an Aramaic translation of the Tanakh, unlike the Targums, which are individual translations of individual books, the Peshitta Tanakh is a single coherent translation of the entire Tanakh, or Hebrew Bible, done at a single point in time. It was still translated by Jews, just like the Targums. However, it fell into disuse among Jews because it seems to have been adopted by the early Christian believers, whereas the Targums were adopted by mainstream Judaism, the Pharisees and scribes, and later the rabbinical authorities. Finally, a note on the use of the words Targums and Targumim may be helpful. Targum is singular, meaning translation. English has adopted the original Hebrew word. The plural of Targum is Targums in English, but Targumim in Hebrew. The Aramaic Targums have a great deal to offer Bible students. A study of them will be richly rewarded as they yield up their treasures in later lessons in this series.